Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're talking to Henry Stark, the author of this novel called Heart Lessons. So welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Now, before we start talking about the book, I was going to ask you, give us the sort of capsule biography. I know you live half the time here in Loudonville, half the year in Chicago. So just give us the short, then people will know who you are, and then we'll talk about the book.
Well, I was born in Europe, in Belgium. I came to America in 1949, settled in New York City with my parents. I went to school in New York. Then married an American girl, became a naturalized citizen, lost my accent, raised a family, became a professor of electrical engineering at Yale. Then I moved on to RPI. Here in Troy, and eventually moved to Chicago. And I commute between Chicago and here because my wife has a good job. She works for the state health department.
Okay.
And so it's really a wonderful existence because Chicago gives me a flavor of the big city, and Albany gives me a flavor of the city and the country. Lots of trees, lots of gardens, and that kind of stuff. So it's really a very nice existence.
That's good. Now, so you're retired now, though?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the book here is a novel. It's a very long novel. I did read some of it. It's like 500 pages. Now, before we talk about the book, though, this book is sort of based on another famous book, and this whole story about this book that it's based on, I feel you could write a whole book about that. So it's called The Grand Coeur.
Right.
And it's never been out in English. So tell us about this book, Grand Coeur, and what that is, because you obviously modeled your book on this famous book, although it's never been in English.
Yes. Well, thank you for asking that question. Grand Coeur is a European classic that's used in schools, primarily in grade schools, what they call école moyenne. And it was my reader in Europe at the Lycée d'Anvers, where I had a French education.
Right. It's not a novel, then? I thought.
Well, I'm getting to that. I'm getting to that. It is a novel in this form. It's the diary of a young boy. He's about 13 years old, and he keeps a day-to-day diary. He talks about his classmates. He talks about issues that have to do with the unification of Italy and things like that. And it's a lot of fun to see him. I wouldn't say losing his innocence, but learning the political and the adult world, if you will.
And that book was written at the end of the 19th century?
That was written at the end of the 19th century, and it originally came out in Italian, and the author became a world-famous writer by the name of Edmundo de Amicis.
And this book was used in schools?
And this book was used in schools as a reader. Now, one of the interesting features of this book is that the students had to read every month a story that they had to discuss afterwards. And these stories typically, now you have to go back for a minute. Edmundo de Amicis was an Italian author, and he was very much concerned with the unification of Italy. So a lot of these stories dealt with heroic acts committed in the process of the unification of Italy. Okay. So you have young kids giving their lives for their country and things like that. I tried to keep the same structure in my book.
Well, I was going to say your book, from reading it, follows it almost exactly. It's about a student, I think he's a freshman in high school.
I was purposely a little vague about where he's at. I prefer to think of him as being a sophomore.
Well, I couldn't tell. It was definitely a high school.
Right.
And in the book, your book, Heart Lessons, he keeps a diary,
Right.
and his teacher assigns him a story a month,
The class.
and then they
as a whole.
discuss the story, just like in the Grand
Right.
Coeur, like you're telling me.
Right.
Of course, there's more to it than that, because there's other incidents. He's keeping a diary about his classmates, what it's like going out and his first girlfriend, and I think near the end a classmate dies, and so he is it safe to say that he goes through a lot of the same changes that the character in the Grand Coeur goes through, or?
Yes, that's a very good observation. He does, except that it's in an American setting, and of course it's in the year 2000 rather than the year 1880. So things have changed.
But it's the same idea.
But it's the same idea. Things, I guess, I was going to say that things are a little bit more violent now, but in a way they aren't, because when you read the original book, there are so many killings due to the fighting between the Austrians and the Italians that if you look at it from the point of view of a war, there's much more killing there than there is in this book. In fact, there's only one death in this book, and that is the death of Frank Fallon, one of his classmates, right?
So I guess the first question is, why did you choose why did you choose to emulate that book? Because you were telling me before that when you read the Grand Coeur,
Right.
this book has affected your whole life. I mean, you still think about it to this. You wrote a whole book.
It has,
in the
Joe.
same style. So I guess before we can talk about your book, what hold does this book have on you that it's that has made you do this? I guess is the word.
Before I answer that question, it's a wonderful question, but before I answer it, I want to give you an example of how this book has affected other people. Grand Coeur. There's a town not far from here, Half Moon, where I used to go for a shave and a haircut. And the guy who used to work on me is an immigrant from Italy. And we got to talking about Grand Coeur. And I said, did you ever hear of Edmundo de Amicis? And he said, oh, Edmundo de Amicis? He said, my God, he's the most famous writer in Italy. And I said, did you ever read Grand Coeur? And he said, you mean Corazon Forte, or the equivalent in Italian? And he said, that's the finest book I've ever read. He said, I remember every word of that book.
And you.
See, and so it had this tremendous impact on him, and I said, well, shake hands. It had the same kind of an impact on me. What the book does is it presents both the boy who keeps the diary and the stories that they have to read. It presents young people in a spot where they have to make moral decisions. Sometimes these moral decisions are very, very costly. To them, to their families, and so on. And I could identify with that. I could say to myself, if I was in this guy's role, in this guy's position, I know how difficult it would be, but I think I would have done the same thing.
And how old were you when you read it?
When I read it, I was just about 10. Okay. And so it had this tremendous impact on me. I began to think a lot about situations where you have to ask yourself, what's the right thing to do? I can take the easy way out and maybe get some gain, but will I be able to live with myself afterwards? Or do I do the right thing and suffer the consequences? And there's quite a bit of that in the original book, and I tried to transfer that into this book.
Well, your stories
Yes.
that the students have to read, they're presented with usually someone their own age in a sort of a moral dilemma.
Right.
And then they have the discussions in the class.
Right.
Okay.
Now, the discussions in the class, I make them much more vivid, and I concentrate on those discussions much more than the original book did. Well, if you like, I'll give you an example of one of these stories.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
Oh,
In the book, there's 8 stories.
right.
And some of them are 10, 12, 15 pages.
Right.
And then there's the discussion. So why don't you just tell us, as an example, of what one of the stories is and sort of how you worked it into the book.
One of my favorite stories, which is patterned after a story in the original, is the story called Dancing Boy.
Okay.
A Dancing Boy tells the story of a inner city youth, a young black boy who lives on the Chicago South Side, which is notorious for being a bad place to live. But he's a good kid. His mother has long vanished, his father has long vanished, and he lives with his grandmother, and she has very little money to give him, so he wears the same clothes year in and year out. And he tries to make the best of his situation, but it's very hard. As I said, he has very little money, and the temptations to join a gang and to get into trouble are very strong, but he resists all of that. And in fact, he ends up spending a lot of time at the Chicago Public Library, where he reads about famous black figures who have done all kinds of great things despite much adversity. Well, one of the ways that he makes money legitimately is to go to a very upscale little park on Michigan Avenue, and anybody who's been to Chicago will know that Michigan Avenue is one of the world's great streets. And what he does is he puts on exhibitions of breakdancing, and then people throw money in a box. And he's very athletic, he's a very good dancer, he does all this breakdancing, and people throw money, and he can walk home with $20 or $30. And with that money, he buys either CDs of Nat King Cole, or he'll buy a sweater for the coming winter, for example. Well, one day while it's a Sunday afternoon in the fall, the sun is out, a whole bunch of buses come having visitors from Scandinavia, well-to-do tourists from Scandinavia. And they are extremely impressed by his breakdancing, and they put a lot of money in. And
I think don't they make like $40 each?
Yeah, there are three of them. Okay. He and his two pals, and they get $40 each. And boy, this is more money than we've ever had, you know. And then after it's over, he's drinking a Coke and he's relaxing, and he's really curious about what these people are talking about. They're all animatedly talking, and he goes over to a little group and he listens to what they're saying. And one of the women in the group says, "You know, these kids dance wonderfully. I've never seen such dancing back home." And there was a man there who was a racist. And he says, well, yeah, he says, they're very good at that sort of thing because that's what they concentrate on. Intellectually, however, they're not nearly as good as our own kids, or words to that effect. And when a boy hears that, he takes this precious amount of money that will change his life in a way, because winter is coming, and Chicago winters are really tough. And he takes the money and he puts it back in the guy's hand, and he says, "I don't take money from people who speak in a disparaging way."
Well, I mean, when I read it, he's crushed when he hears this.
Pardon me?
He's crushed when he...
Oh, he's crushed. He breaks into tears. Yeah. He's crushed. It's terrible for him to have to make that decision. And it parallels the story of a young, I forgot, I think it was a Sardinian who is on a ship in the Mediterranean, and he's very poor, and he's returning to his parents back in 1880. And some people give him money because they see how poor he is, and then he hears some people talk in a very disparaging way of Sardinians, you know, and so he gives them back the money.
Right. Well, we're going to confuse people with the two books, but
okay.
So the story about the kids breakdancing, giving the money back, is a story. Right. Within the story, art lessons.
Right, it's one of the 8 stories you mentioned earlier.
And then all the kids in the class, they all have different reactions to the story. I think one kid said, well, I would have kept the money anyway, and one kid says, oh, no. So they sort of learn a lesson from the story, of course, obviously.
Right, absolutely. That's the point. The students now discuss this story, and some of them can't figure out why in the world did he give back the story. Why not simply go over to the guy and say, hey, I don't like what you're saying about black people, and keep the money. And others say, well, maybe some people said bad things about black people because there's a lot of black crime in the community. And then there's that kind of a discussion. And then there's a black kid in class who says, now, wait a minute, there's a lot of crime everywhere in the world, so, don't just point it at us.
The kids after each story, when they have these animated sort of
They have these very animated discussions, exactly. And then there is one boy. Now, our hero is not the smartest kid in the world, but he's pretty sharp.
He's like he observes everything.
He observes everything, and, he often says, gee, I wish I would have said that, or I wish I could have thought of that.
He's not, I guess you could say, he's not the smartest kid in the class. He's not the worst student, but he's sort of your average Joe, but his name is Michael Prescott. But.
Right.
But
if you remember, there is one student who makes a very good point by relating a situation that he observed when he was in transit from the Soviet Union to Israel to the United States. And a similar situation had occurred with an Arab salesman in the old city of Jerusalem. Anyway, the boy tells the story. And when he does, our hero finally understands that to simply complain wouldn't have been enough in this case.
You have to take some action.
Huh?
You have to take some action.
Yeah, he had to take some action. Very well, that's right. Very well put. He had to take some action. He had to show how painful this was. And just to say it was painful wasn't enough. But to return the money was a very good indication of how painful it was to him.
Well, the other interesting thing about when the kids have all the discussions, you have a class where you have some typical Americans, you have some kids who are children of immigrants, and it's like a wide, I guess, a multicultural class or whatever. Is that on purpose? You try to get everyone?
It was on purpose.
Oh, okay.
It was on purpose. And Joe, Chicago is to some extent an immigrant city, and if you did the school that I patterned the school in the book at, it really does exist, and there are many immigrant students in school in Chicago. You'd be hard put to find a school that didn't.
So then the book carries on.
Yeah.
With stories like the one you told and the kids talk about. But in between, there's other stuff that goes on where I think his second grade teacher visits him, and he's realizing that she's declining, and someone he really loved, and he has his first girlfriend, and there's various. So I guess the thing is, we're talking about YA literature, what we in the library world call young adult. It's a separate genre. Are you... we don't have the YA sticker here, but would you say that you're aiming this for teens specifically? I mean, anyone can read it. It's a good book, but are you aiming it for teens? As in would you want it to be a designated YA novel, or does it matter to you, or just as long as people read it, I guess is the...
Yeah, I think as long as people read it, I think it would be most effective in its message to younger people.
If teens read it.
Yeah, teens. I think a typical adult would read the book maybe and say, hey, that's a pretty good book. I'll get it for my grandson who's graduating from high school, that kind of thing.
Well, there's some little interesting things in here. The kids, they have to write a paper, and he comes complaining, and then they put the play on of All My Sons.
Oh, yes.
And so it isn't just a story of the 8 stories and the discussion. There's a lot of stuff about being a typical teenager in 2008, I guess you could say.
Yes.
The book just came out.
Yes.
Well, I guess the question is then, it's a book, it's a story about stories, the power of stories. I mean, I'm trying to think what, that seems to be a good way to, well, of course, teaching through stories is since the humankind began, I guess, is the way that we teach. Can you say something about that, sort of the power of stories to impart knowledge?
Well,
I'm thinking the Bible. The Bible is a story.
I think it's an absolutely wonderful point. Telling stories is a much more important activity than many people think.
Oh no, I agree with you.
You know, coming back, and you raised the point of the Bible. After all, the Bible tells stories. I'd like to say something that sort of connects the Bible and the book.
Well, there were some.
There are a lot of quotes from the Bible.
Yeah.
There are a lot of quotes in the Bible, from the Bible in the book. Because the same kind of issues that are discussed here were discussed in the Bible.
Oh, of course.
Somewhat
Yes.
different context,
Yeah.
obviously, but
And
you know,
many holy books in all the various religions have these sort of stories.
exactly. The Indian Holy Book tells very similar stories to what the Bible tells. And
So you want to say something about the Bible?
yeah, it's funny. At this point in my life, when I read the Bible, I realize what wonderful stories they are and how beautiful they're written. And, you know, I think some of the greatest literature that has ever occurred. But when I read this book in the original, except translated into the original Grand Coeur,
The Grand Coeur, of course.
the original book.
I know people can be confused.
No, when I read the original, well, to end the confusion, this is a, let's say, an updated and Americanized version of Grand Coeur.
And then Grand Coeur, how is that translated? I think you wrote stout heart
Yes, it's...
or strong heart.
Well, strong heart, but, you know, that could be misinterpreted as saying, boy, this guy, he runs the mile in 4 minutes, he's got a strong heart. You would never say that in French, you know, you wouldn't say he's got... When you say in French, grand coeur, you mean stout heart. This is well, I don't know, do you know the meaning of the word mensch? Then people say, this guy's a mensch.
Like
That's
a good
what
guy,
it is, a good guy.
Well, then
a good guy.
your book is called Heart Lessons, obviously learning
That's right.
learning for the heart from the heart.
Learning
or
for the
whatever.
heart, right.
So anyway, back to the Bible.
Well, I was going to say, when I finished reading this book and we discussed it, I didn't realize at the time, but this had made a tremendous impact on me, the stories in this book. And later, when I came to America, my father didn't really know the American system of education, so the first few years, he just put me in a religious school, even though I was completely unprepared to go to religious school. And there was a great deal of emphasis on the do's and don'ts of what you could do and what you couldn't do. You couldn't eat this, but you could eat that, and the like. And I found it much harder to find the moral stories
As opposed
in
to the
the
do's
lessons.
and don'ts.
Yes, I found it very hard to find the moral stories in these do's and don'ts that I did here, you see. So in a way, this book, in terms of character development, might say had a stronger impact. The original Grand
The Grand Coeur, yes.
And that's why I felt so strongly about doing this book.
That you wanted to model. Well, the Grand Coeur has affected your life, so it really comes through from not just today, but...
Yeah, and I wanted to share it a little bit.
And you'd sort of, I guess you could say, put it in a modern context or whatever.
Modern context.
Well, one question is, the teacher in the book, Mr. Andrews, I guess maybe you could tell us about him, because I don't think he's your typical teacher. He's having the kids read these stories and discuss them. They put the play on. He shows them Iranian movies. He has the two fathers meet when there was a dispute, and he brought the fathers in. So the teacher is kind of a really good guy.
Oh, he's a wonderful teacher. I wish I'd had teachers like that. Mr. Andrews, he's a wonderful teacher. I patterned him after the teacher in the original, whose name was Mr. Perboni, an Italian teacher. No, Mr. Andrews is a wonderful teacher, and as he explains to the students, he says, you know, I don't have anybody left. I lost my wife to a malignant illness, and you've become my family at this point, and I'm going to do all I can to impart knowledge to you, and maybe even a little more than knowledge.
But not just himself. He's using stories away.
And he's using stories.
He's not just...
No, he selects those stories.
He's not doing the
for them to
do's and
read.
don'ts like...
No, he's not doing do's and don'ts,
Yes.
exactly. Exactly. Well, I don't know. Did you get a chance to read the story from, let's see, from Montevideo to Delray to Lhasa?
No, I didn't get that far.
Okay, yeah, that's towards the end. That's a fairly lengthy story. There's a young kid who leads a very comfortable life. The kids have to read this and then discuss it, okay? So this is one of the 8 stories.
One of the 8 stories, okay.
Okay. So the kid has a very comfortable life in Montevideo, Uruguay, which is a modern city, and by and large, many of the people, not all, but many of the people are well-to-do, and they lead the life of Riley, as they say, okay? And the kid already has been told, you know, you're going to inherit all of this and blah, 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 and he's disgusted with the whole thing. He wants to do something meaningful in his life, okay? So he begins to plague his parents to let him come to the United States, where he can just try to live, okay? And finally, after plaguing them for days on end, I don't mean use the word plaguing in the sense that he's obnoxious, but he tries to argue with them logically.
Send me to America.
Send me to America. Let me find out what the rest of the world looks like, okay? And then finally, his mother says, you know what, she says, we do have an uncle in Boca Raton, which is in Florida. And you can stay with him and see how well you make out. And remember, you can always come back if there's any problem. So he goes there, and he very quickly adapts to American life. And he meets an old man with a dog, and the old man is all alone. And he develops this friendship with the old man, who tells him all about World War II and what it was like to be a partisan, an underground fighter, and the moral decisions he had to make in World War II. And that impresses the boy very much. And eventually he decides that even life in South Florida is too easy, despite the fact that he's got to work and all kinds of, it's too easy for him. So he, at the very end, decides that he's going to go to Lhasa and join a small team of blind people from Europe who are helping blind kids in Lhasa to make it in life. I like that story, and it's...
So how do the kids, because I didn't get this far, how do the kids react to that story?
Oh, that story generates a lot of rough discussion. Okay. In fact, the teacher has to intervene. One kid says, well, this is really stupid. Why the heck didn't he just go on to college? And if he really wanted to help the blind, he should have gone on to medical school and taken a specialty in ophthalmology, and then he could have helped them. I mean, what can this kid do? Okay, and then other people say, "Why you always think in terms of degrees and making money and that kind of thing." Another person says, oh yeah, what did he prove? He proved nothing. He's got these wealthy parents back home, so whenever he can get into trouble, all he does is he goes back. He hasn't taken any chances. And then other people say, yeah, he has taken chances. He could have taken, he could have watched TV all day long back home, and he didn't have to do anything, and here he is, breaking his,
Well, one interesting thing about the reaction to all the kids to all these stories, there really isn't one interpretation of any of these stories, really.
No, that's a good point, Joe. There isn't, and I don't know how I would.
Well, that's the power of stories. Well,
I don't know how I would have done.
Well, anyway, our time is up. I can't believe it went so fast. But the book is Heart Lessons, Henry Stark, and we have a copy in the library if you want to come in and check it out. But you can get it on Amazon, and
yeah, if I may add something.
Oh, sure.
On Amazon, simply put in my name, Stark, S-T-A-R-K, and Heart Lessons.
Oh, yeah, I put in Heart Lessons and it came right up. So.
Yeah, it comes right up. You can get it in other places, but Amazon, I think, is the easiest place to get it.
Okay, well, I know you were saying this is sort of a, what would you say, publish on demand kind of book, but hopefully you said you sent it to some mainstream publishers and agents, so hopefully the book will get out there, and then you can come back again and see us. And thanks for coming today.
It was a real pleasure. It was very nice. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, thanks for watching Meet the Author, and we'll see you next time.